I just kind of wanted to come back to the point I've been hearing a lot about, like pastoral feminism and the prison-industrial complex. And before I ask my question, there's like two things I need to say to kind of frame it. And it's one is like, growing up in school and university, my experience, my friends, everyone I knew was always that if there was like intimate violence, if there was rape, if there was sexual assault, you don't call the police. Like if you want to make a traumatic experience more traumatic, then you can get the police involved, but they're not going to believe you, you're going to get questions, it's going to throw your character into all these horrible situations. So like that's always been the mindset I've come to it with. And then as an undergraduate in the UK, the idea of campus being a safe space was always very much dependent on there not being police on campus. The LLC, which has been occupied by students right now, and the idea under occupation was we will not have the police on campus when we're protesting because that automatically makes this an unsafe space. And then I came to the US for grad school and I suddenly see that there's this thing called campus police. This is really weird. Like I've already like waiting for a coffee at Dunkin' Donuts and the guy in front of me has like a gun in his back pocket. Like this is just culturally very weird. And then there's police on campus and I can't help but wonder when we talk about like Title IX, and maybe Katie, you could talk about this as like a student organizing, but activism for safe spaces on campus and making it safe. I wonder if we almost kind of closed down the conversation before we started because we've already got these police on campus. It was almost like this sort of like the good cop, bad cop idea, like campus police. I feel are meant to like make you think that like the police are friendly and they're okay and they can help you. And I really wonder whether this helps at all, whether it's then got people trying to navigate the real world of trying to get justice for sexual assault and for rape or for any kind of gendered sexual violence. Like that we've already set the time to the conversation there. We've already got this idea that the police are a way of getting an answer, and that this like defines our limits for the conversation, which actually I don't think is helpful. And I'm really happy you could talk to that.
Yeah. So I also grew up in Denmark, so coming back to the States was a shock.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I would see maybe like one police officer a month and never with anything besides his uniform and a badge maybe. So with regards to your question, I would just like to clarify that like within our movement, at least on Northeastern, like we are already thinking of that. Like one of our biggest issues with the reporting and service entire procedure at Northeastern is that if you need to report on weeknights after business hours or on weekends, your only option to report is to go to NUPD. And during each shift, it gets worse. Each shift, they only have one officer who is trained as a first responder. So at a school of, 16,000 undergrads, if you need to go and report a sexual assault, and that officer has already been called because someone else, elsewhere on campus or off campus needs to report a sexual assault, you're going to be paired with a detective who is not equipped to deal with your trauma and will be definitively re-traumatizing you, even more than, an officer who is potentially trained in these could. So yeah, I agree with your premise. We, as a group who are trying to change this on campus, agree with your premise. And I think our difficulty is there's so much wrong that we don't really know how to start to tackle it or where to start to tackle it. So our big initiative right now is we're pushing to get a Women and Gender Resource Center on campus. Just as like a start, so our sexual assault services are also not a physical location, it's a network. It's really difficult to access. It's pretty inadequate if you do even figure out how to access it. So we're trying to promote the center just as a start, so at least we can point to a place and say, look, they're doing A, B, and C wrong, and we can hold them accountable. So yeah, I think that's a really good point and something that we're all thinking about.
Also to follow up, since I started out organizing on Tufts campus for a better sexual assault policy, and the thing about Title IX is it's a civil rights law, so it's about your civil rights, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the police, and I think that's why so many activists have been organizing around Title IX, because they want that option outside of the court system, and they don't trust the police, and the police, and there's been some more pushes like, oh, well, this is a crime, et cetera, we should be pushing all the cases to the cops. Some legislators have been proposing that, and there's been a very big push against that. Like, we don't want that, and for me, like, I've been raped on campus and off campus, and I've only done anything when it's been on campus rape just because I felt more empowered that I had tools outside of the prison industrial complex to find some sort of resolution. I felt that my identity and just like my relationship to the identities of my assailants or whatever just made it more feasible for me to have a safer experience to get onto that path of healing. Like, clearly it didn't turn out really well, but I'm still happy that I did that instead of like going to the cops. Like, yeah. So yeah, I don't think there's like this bad cop, good cop idea. I mean, if you want to get your rights handled under Title IX, you don't have to talk to the cops at all, ever. You can just go to, I don't know, dean of students or whomever is in charge on your campus.
Denise, did you have something before?
Oh, it was going back to what you were saying.
I'd just like to echo the point that was brought up before, that who can talk about pleasure is deeply political and is deeply politicized, like if you're already othered in the larger society and you're exotified and you're fetishized, then speaking about pleasure almost immediately, without whether you mean it or not, plays into this othered, fetishized, exotified idea of you. And it's very hard to speak in a place where you're the one talking and you're not talking into these tropes and these archetypes that people are immediately projecting on you. And now we've talked about ethnic difference, we've talked about people who are gender non-conforming, we've talked about racial difference, but we haven't talked about post-colonial or people who are coming from like colonized backgrounds and we haven't talked about at all religious difference. So as a South Asian American and as a Muslim American, having these conversations especially in white feminist spaces is really problematic because everyone's trying to come and save me. And I don't think to be saved. And Muslim women across the world are saying that, and certainly other Muslim American women, and not only exclusively Muslim American women, are saying, feminine and everyone else, step back. But talking about pleasure and talking about sex publicly and talking about our bodies and talking about our experiences really gets instrumentalized a lot of the time by people who are just immediately playing into this narrative of like, Muslim women are oppressed and feminism needs to save them, and totally marginalizing the voices of Muslim feminists and academic Muslim feminists in the academy who are talking specifically about Islamic feminism and just their experiences in this larger surveillance state. So I just wanted to say that because it hasn't come up at all so far today.
I wanted to also talk about pleasure, and when I found out about this event and I came, the reason I chose to attend was because I've been sort of struggling with questions of what is female pleasure, where is it represented, because I don't see it a lot. I think we have so much of a focus on sex in the way that we represent pleasure, which is not to say that sex is not pleasurable, but I think it's such a much broader theme than that. But anyways, I was having a lot of thoughts on this as we've been going through this discussion, so I'm going to try and tie them together, but forgive me if they're a bit discombobulated. I think part of the reason why it's so difficult to talk about pleasure is that it can be such an individual thing, and that there are a lot of shared experiences of danger that we have as women, as any group of people who are sharing an oppression, that it's quite easy to come together and speak about those, but pleasure is something that's incredibly individual and incredibly vulnerable because of that. But I think that pleasure pleasure is such an important process for healing coming out of those shared experiences of danger. So my personal experience is that I was sexually assaulted during a massage And that threw a wrench into my interpretation of physical pleasure. And coming out of that, trying to understand what does that mean? What does that mean where this thing that I was taking such enjoyment from was twisted? And so it then led me on this path of wanting to understand pleasure, wanting to hear from other people what their experiences are with that, because I'm not quite sure where mine is. So that's to put that forward as sort of, I guess, a plea for shared experience, even though I know it's a very individual thing and it's difficult to speak about, but I do think that it's really important.
So I was hoping we could come back to this, the term pleasure and danger that people have historicized. And what I'm concluding from this conversation is that while things have changed, some of the same tensions that we began with continue to today. So I want to make sure I'm taking the right take-home message. And there's also a suggestion that this took feminism down a different, perhaps less productive path. Right? There was something in terms of not looking at political economy and not opening up other spaces of analysis. And so what I'm interested in all of you is this a useful frame today? Or should we be thinking in other ways? Or is there a trap in getting too caught up in this today?
I mean, I think part of it is about how we're defining, like I think what just happened was really interesting because I have been thinking about pleasure as a collective thing and not an individual thing. And I think that is actually maybe why Suzanne and I butt heads about whether or not pleasure is inherently related to sex, because and I wish she was still here when Raina presented, about the STAR community, and what sounded to me was these trans folk working as sex workers for the pleasure of creating a community that supported other queer and trans folk, whether or not they wanted to work as sex workers or not, and that it was sort of the pleasure of creating that community that was being gained by putting themselves in danger on the street, right? And so like in that framework, I was thinking like, oh, like pleasure can be radical when it's like this collective sort of thing, which is not to say I don't think it can be radical when it's an individual thing, but I think like is the pleasure danger couplet useful? Well, can we even agree on like what pleasure is, like how to conceptualize each of those things? I don't know.
I think, Julie, I heard you referencing Audre Lorde and the erotic as power, which she's talked right after Andrea Dworkin.
Right.
Right? So it kind of like there's a funny way that we're in this history, right? This is, but I liked what Janet said about that kind of coming at a moment and putting the nail in the coffin of a socialist feminism.
Just one of the many nails. Many nails.
So for me, like the legacy of pleasure and danger is a dichotomization of pro-sex, anti-sex, and everything that comes with that. Which, even when we say that that's not what we're doing, often undergirds our concepts, our analysis, and that's troubling to me. And that goes along with a kind of individualist understanding of pleasure, of choice, of consent, of like liberal and neoliberal versions of all of those things, which I don't find, they're helpful. I'm a cultural anthropologist. They're helpful because this is the world we live in, and these are the concepts and terms that organize that world, at least for me, for the people that I work with. So they're helpful in that sense, but they're not right. They're not so it's sort of our task to rethink them now, I think. People have been rethinking them for a long time.
Yeah. I just want to speak to, I think your name is Taylor, and what Sarah was saying in terms of the erotic and collective and what that and how that can be, what that looks like, right? So, in collective pleasure, that's not just like social justice, that it is actual pleasure, right? Because I think like, well, I mean, not saying that that's not actual pleasure, but because I believe it is, but I also think that what, you know, Susanna says is also really important. Like, what is it about collective eroticism that now, that's, you know, that kind of gets divorced from actual like sexual autonomy, right? And I have this colleague who studies Black queer sissy bounce in New Orleans, and part of it, it's being, and this sort of goes back to Beyonce, is that these collective communities that have experienced so much trauma via Katrina go to these bars and these clubs, participate in this, what can be seen as this very sexualized dance, right? But when he talks to these people, it's about the collective space of dancing together in unison through like kind of like these heightened beats. So it's kind of like this heightened sense, right? And I think that's in some ways bringing two things together, where once we can retain our own power, how we understand the erotic, and then where it's away from these stereotypical places, there is you have to redefine it. And there's a way that happens for many marginalized communities, whether it be food, whether it be dance, whether it be religion, through cultural areas that I think that sometimes gets taken for granted. So I don't know, I do think part of the erotic is higher, in some ways higher than pleasure, what Audre Lorde says, right? Where it definitely comes from a different like spiritual place, that at least that I've seen pleasure, you know, written about.
Go ahead, actually. I can wait. Okay.
Sure. Well, I'm a law student at Harvard, and one of Professor Halley's colleagues, Professor Jeannie Soup, was my criminal law professor, and we spent a good percentage of the semester discussing the law of rape. And one point that she made over and over was that the over-criminalization of sexual assault has contributed to a societal narrative of women as victims. And I'm just wondering how people feel about the notion that putting emphasis on the danger aspect can make it more difficult for us to collectively accept the pleasure aspect here, and also potentially make it more difficult for women to be resilient who have faced sexual assault. One article we were assigned to read was about focusing on resiliency for victims as opposed to criminalization of perpetrators. And I don't know what my position is on this, but I was hoping somebody else could talk about that.
That's a difficult question. Really difficult question. Just spin the bike. Take a stab at it.
No taking that one. Actually, let me say this. It might be a good time to do this. That we can continue this conversation over drinks. Is my suggestion. It's all ready. We have wonderful food and drink. And I don't know about you, but all this talk of danger makes me a little pleasant. And so I invite everyone to come join us. You go just through these doors to the left, and
hold on, let me go get my